Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Fry Brain Science. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Fry. If you're new here, please like and subscribe. Last week we talked about 10 critical events involving radiation or nuclear material. This episode we'll be talking about the fascinating world of poisonous animals by covering 10 representative lineages that span the full taxonomical and ecological diversity. Let's first start with a bit of housekeeping. Poisonous animals differ from venomous animals in several important ways. First, while venomous animals make all of their own toxins, poisonous animals may make it themselves or accumulate it from their diet by eating other poisonous animals and hijacking these toxins to store in their own body. Another difference is that unlike venomous animals, which actively deliver large toxins by creating a wound, the small toxins of poisonous animals are delivered passively when the animal is touched or eaten. The small size of animal poisons, up to 1,000th the size of some toxins and venoms, allows them to spread into any part of the body, even into the brain. Not only does this make the effects much more dynamic, but it also makes them much harder to treat. For many, there is no antidote. The patient is kept alive using machines, such as artificial respiration, until they either survive or die. Our first group of poisonous animals are turtles. Specifically, sea turtles. Now, you might not think of sea turtles as a poisonous animal, but many species actually are, and in some cases, lethally so. This is because sea turtles consume a wide variety of highly toxic prey and vegetable matter, including toxic algae and sponges, as well as venomous cnidarians such as jellyfish. Consequently, their flesh can become incredibly toxic. This means that anyone who eats the meat of one of these turtles is likely to suffer from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and other gastrointestinal complaints. A particularly toxic species is the hawksbill sea turtle. Hawksbills have a worldwide distribution, but it's the population in Southeast Asia and Australia that are especially toxic because they gorge themselves on a really nasty type of algae. As sea turtles are still eaten as part of indigenous cultural diets, poisonings are not a thing of the past, but still occur today. As these turtles are extremely endangered, they shouldn't be killed anyway, but really this is one more reason to let them be in peace. In at number 2, we have birds. Birds, you say? Poisonous birds? Well, actually, yes. In some cases, they're actually lethal. They're so toxic. For example, the pitihui bird of Papua New Guinea is extraordinarily toxic due to the very potent neurotoxins located on its feathers, which cause the exact same symptoms as you would experience if you licked a poison dart frog from South America. And this is because the birds are not making the toxins themselves, neither are the poison dart frogs. In both cases, they're feeding on toxic insects that are making the toxins. And in this case, one of the toxin types, Batrachatoxin, is found on both of the animals due to the insects that they're eating making this kind of toxin. This toxin is an extraordinarily potent neurotoxin that acts on the sodium channels, causing lethal paralysis. And they actually can act on heart muscles as well, causing abnormal heart rhythm and eventually cardiac arrest. And there's no antidote. You either survive or you don't. Another type of poisonous bird is the common quail, which during breeding season migrations becomes incredibly toxic due to the plants that it's eating, which can lead to a non-fatal but extremely uncomfortable and potentially crippling disease characterized by the breakdown of your skeletal muscles. So a very unusual type of poisoning, but showing how unpredictable poisonous animals really can be. In at number 3, we have the blister beetle, an infamous and quasi-iconic animal under its alternate name, Spanish fly, due to its purported aphrodisiac effects, which we'll get to later. Now, blister beetles produce an extremely potent toxin called cantharidin that they use to defend themselves against predators. The toxin is absorbed by the skin on contact and causes terrible blistering and extreme burning pain. If the beetle is eaten, the toxin causes ulcers, blistering, and bleeding throughout the digestive tract and can result in death. Now, the beetles are not flies, and nor are they Spanish, but when sold as an aphrodisiac, blister beetles are marketed as Spanish flies. Probably because ooze of blister beetle doesn't exactly sound like something you'd want to rub on your penis. And in fact, you don't want to be rubbing this on there at all. Its reputation as a natural form of Viagra is highly overrated, and there's actually been more cases of death than successful erections. So not only does this neurotoxin not stimulate arousal, it may in fact eliminate all desire permanently. Cantharidin, however, has been very useful as a medicine for burning off warts, which gives you an idea of how it would feel if you rubbed it on your penis. And this is why most extracts of Spanish fly don't actually contain blister beetle ooze. In at number 4, we have the Barracuda, which is the epitome of a much more fundamental problem of how large fish around tropical reefs can accumulate through their diet extremely potent toxins, which in this case is a toxin called Saxotoxin, which produces ciguatera food poisoning. Now, the small fish fed on by the Barracuda aren't making the toxins, nor the smaller fish they feed on, and so on, until you get all the way down to the bottom of the food chain, and then you have really small fish feeding on microorganisms called dinoflagellates, and the dinoflagellates are making the toxin. And then it starts accumulating through the food chain, getting passed up until the large, long-lived fish who have eaten a lot of smaller fish accumulate enough in their flesh that they become dangerous and even lethal to eat. Ciguatera fish poisoning is a huge issue across the equatorial saltwater fisheries, affecting hundreds of thousands of people each year, with massive medical and economic impacts. Symptoms may take up to 12 hours to show up. The initial symptoms are what you'd get for eating any sort of dodgy seafood, a nice big case of explosive diarrhea. But then the toxin binds to sodium channels on the nerves to stimulate them, causing a nervous excitability. This triggers some really unsettling effects on the heart, including a slower than usual heartbeat that's also irregular. And despite the heart rate slowing down, the blood pressure can spike. There is also a characteristic symptom that's quite useful for diagnosis, and that's one of temperature reversal, where if you put the patient's hand in warm water, they will say it feels like ice water, but if you put it in ice water, they'll scream like you've just put their hand in boiling water. We have absolutely no idea what's going neurologically to produce this baffling symptom, but clearly nothing good. The diarrhea may last for only a couple days, but the cardiac symptoms may last for up to 2 months, and in severe cases, it may take up to a year to fully recover and return to complete strength and normal neurological function. In lethal cases, death is due to cardiac arrest. There's no specific treatment currently. Mannitol has been suggested, but there's no conclusive clinical trial supporting this. To illustrate the severity of this particular bioaccumulated toxin, here's the details of a tragic case report. A dinner party of 7 included a near-term pregnancy who was only 2 days away from the expected delivery date. Within 4 hours of ingesting the fish, all complained of the characteristic symptoms of ciguatera, including nausea, weakness, intense burning and prickling sensations of the fingers, lips, scalp, and tongue. And conspicuously, they all reported a burning sensation upon touching cold water. So it was a nice clear-cut case in that regard. The pregnant woman unfortunately experienced tumultuous fetal movements and an intermittent, very peculiar fetal shivering, which became evident simultaneously with her own systemic symptoms. These unusual fetal movements continued for 18 hours and then gradually decreased over the subsequent 24 hours. However, the baby was born with severe facial palsy and with respiratory distress. At age of 6 weeks, the baby was still unable to smile. And at this time, the mother herself still experienced increased sensitivity of her sight, sound, touch, and smell. The clinical report concludes there's no follow-up report of how well, if at all, the baby recovered. So we don't know if, in this case, the effects were permanent, but clearly there was a very strong chance of losing that baby, which is underscoring why pregnant women need to be extraordinarily careful with their diet and particularly avoid all types of seafood. At number 5, we have poisonous snakes. No, not venomous snakes, poisonous. As we talked about, there's an important distinction. So these are the tiger keelback snakes in the Asian Natricine genus Rhabdophis. Really fascinating animals, so incredibly cool. When I lived in Asia, working with them was one of the highlights of my career. So first off, as a parenthetical aside, they are venomous, lethally so. They look like brightly colored Asian versions of American garter snakes, which had them imported into the US pet trade for a brief but spectacular period of time, until two teenage boys presented at LA County General Hospital, bleeding out of everywhere that you don't want to be bleeding out of. Which, when the Japanese Poison Control was contacted for help, they were shocked that the snakes were being sold as harmless pets, since their venom is so toxic on its action upon the blood that people have died, and the Japanese even make an anti-venom. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here because they're a rare and wonderful case of an animal that is both venomous and poisonous. It's venomous in that, like other snakes, it makes toxins from the glands located in the upper jaw behind the eye. In this particular case, they're enzymes that activate the blood clotting cascade like a big overdose. But they're also poisonous in that they have special glands on the back of their neck that ooze out a milky white substance that looks a lot like that which is on the back of a toad. And in fact, that's exactly what it is. The snakes use their venom to feed upon toads, almost exclusively, which not only gives them nutrition, but also how they harvest this chemical defense. They bioaccumulate the toad toxins into their body, which are then stored in these glands, and when they feel threatened, they start secreting it just like a toad. So if a predator tries to eat them, it will have the same unpleasant experience as if it tried to eat a toad, including digitoxin-like effects on the heart, which can be lethal. Number 6, pufferfish. Pufferfish and toadfish graze on algae and other parts of the benthic goo. In doing so, they bioaccumulate into their liver, kidneys, and spikes the mind-blowingly potent Tetrodotoxin, which at 1,200 times the potency of cyanide is one of the most toxic natural compounds. Each fish contains enough to kill at least 30 full-grown humans. Amazingly, pufferfish is used in a Japanese cuisine called fugu. While the meat of some species is considered an expensive delicacy, it can be fatal if prepared incorrectly, and thus should only be eaten when cooked by a licensed chef. According to the Japanese Health Ministry statistics, incorrectly fugu is one of the most frequent causes of severe food poisoning in the country. In a particularly bad year, 176 people died from poorly prepared fugu. Tetrodotoxin acts by blocking sodium channels, and like getting the wrong key stuck in a door, the channels are left jammed, making nerve conduction impossible. This leads to lethal paralysis, with death the result of respiratory failure, which is just a fancy way of saying you stop breathing. In severe cases, about half the people die. A tragic case report underscores just how severe and fast-acting tetrodotoxin is. An 11-year-old boy was given 5 small fish at a pier that were cleaned, but the skin was not removed. He took them home and 4 were cooked. The 5th was stolen by the family cat. At 6 p.m., the father and son were served first, but the father didn't like the taste, so fed them to the cat. At 6:40, the boy said his legs, feet, and hands felt numb and his body seemed to be floating. Soon after, he complained of feeling cold and said he could not move his arms or legs. He also could not swallow. At 7:30, he lost consciousness. At 7:50, he was unresponsive upon being presented at the hospital. At 8 o'clock, he was dead. Upon returning home, the family found their dead cat. Number 7. We have Tetrodotoxin again, but in this case, it's part of a chemical arms race between rough-skinned newts and garter snakes. Tetrodotoxin shows up all over the animal kingdom, and in some cases, it's part of an evolutionary arms race. Rough-skinned newts have bacteria living on them that makes Tetrodotoxin. The newts have evolved resistance, and as a general characteristic, they accumulate Tetrodotoxin to some level or another. In a couple different populations, they've independently evolved to massively accumulate Tetrodotoxin. And so they have levels that are off the charts. And then there's a predator. In this case, it's the garter snakes, which feed on rough-skinned newts, and these garter snakes are also evolving resistance. So this appears to have stimulated a very complex predator-prey chemical arms race, whereby the more toxin the newts can accumulate, the snakes are under a reciprocal pressure to evolve to become more resistant so they can keep feeding on those newts, which in turn puts a pressure back onto the newts for them to accumulate even more Tetrodotoxin. So it's a race with life on the line. So there's a nice overlay where the newt populations that are the most extreme in their accumulation of Tetrodotoxin are fed upon by the garter snakes that are also the more resistant. In addition, what's really cool is that it appears that the snakes themselves are accumulating Tetrodotoxin from their newt prey, perhaps as an anti-predator defense against the hawks that are feeding on the snakes. So, does this mean that in time we may see hawks that are resistant and bioaccumulating it? It's quite possible. Number 8, we have toxic lobster. Lobster are not normally toxic, but in some cases they become toxic due to bioaccumulation of a potent toxin called Saxotoxin, also known as the paralytic seafood toxin. It's bioaccumulated into a wide range of animals from lobster through to abalone. It's like Tetrodotoxin in that it jams sodium channels, preventing them from stimulating a nerve transmission, thereby leading to a lethal paralysis, and there is no antidote. You either survive or you don't. Now, these toxins aren't made by the lobster or abalone or other animals. Rather, they're bioaccumulated in the diet, and the source of them are algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms secrete a wide range of potent toxins capable of causing severe injury or death to humans. Now, climate change is warming the ocean waters, thereby favoring harmful algal bloom conditions and thus resulting in more frequent and widespread toxic outbreaks. In addition to their profound direct threat to human health, harmful algal blooms cause a massive loss of productivity and profitability to the seafood industry. And this is due to their bioaccumulation into the flesh of animals destined for the market. Consequently, these secreted toxins are responsible for massive annual economic losses. Over 200 million in Australia alone and globally exceeding 1 billion. Acute events can be particularly catastrophic, such as in 2012, there was Saxotoxin being bioaccumulated into the Tasmanian rock lobster and abalone, with the loss of these wild stocks resulting in $23 million loss of seafood just in that one outbreak. At number 9, we have poison dart frogs. Poison dart frogs are small, brightly patterned frogs that come out during the bright of the day, which is a clear indication of predators to stay away. They get their name from the use by the indigenous people of the Americas who would dip their blowgun darts into the secretions and then use that to paralyze the animals that they were hunting. The poison is on the skin and readily affects anyone who touches it or eats it because they're very small toxins that quickly absorb. They have a dizzying array of different neurotoxins, some that turn channels on, some that turn channels off, some that cause spastic paralysis, some that cause limb paralysis, others that affect the heart rate, and a myriad of other conditions, all of which have made them of tremendous interest for biodiscovery use in drug design and development. What's really cool is that the different types of toxins and the relative levels can vary not just tremendously between species, but tremendously within populations of different species. And this is because the frogs aren't making the toxins themselves. Like so many other poisonous animals, they're bioaccumulating it through their diet, in this case, small insects. And this is also reflected in dart frogs that are kept in captivity and fed fruit flies or other common harmless insects. Well, the frogs themselves are totally harmless, beautiful pets. Similarly, poison dart frogs that were introduced to Hawaii as a method of biocontrol, which ultimately failed. But the frogs themselves are established in Hawaii, but they're completely harmless. And that's because the Hawaiian insects that they're eating, luckily, aren't toxic, or else they would have introduced a new toxic animal to Hawaii. So, of the different poison dart frogs, of these, the golden dart frog is considered the most toxic of all of them. So it's by far the most toxic of a group of incredibly toxic animals. And this makes the golden dart frog one of the most toxic animals out there in the entire world. And while they might look like they have a sunny disposition, the golden dart frog isn't, the most easygoing, friendly type. He's more of the touch me and you'll die type. So this type of poison dart frog is found in the rainforest of the Pacific coast of Colombia. And as I mentioned, that these are defensive toxins. They're not an aggressive one, but if you were stupid enough to try to pick one up, you'd be hit with a generous dose of this kind of incredibly potent neurotoxin that would eventually stop your heart from beating. And there's an estimated enough on one frog to kill 20 people. But as with so many other toxic animals, poison dart frogs have yielded compounds of tremendous use in drug design and development. They've yielded a myriad of compounds with potential uses as diverse as painkillers, muscle relaxants, heart stimulants, and even appetite suppressants. But these frogs, like so many others out there, are in critical decline, from habitat destruction through to the rampant wildfire that is chytrid fungus. So it's another one of those cases that we're losing not just super cool and awesome animals, but we're losing potential sources of billion-dollar wonder drugs. Last in this poisonous animal run-through, we have cane toads. While cane toads are less toxic overall than many others on this list, they've actually been the most devastating and have affected more animals and had a greater human impact than any of these other animals. And this is because, as we'll talk about in a future episode on invasive animals, they're one of the most widely spread and worst invasive animals across the globe. And even worse, this is because they were deliberately introduced on a myriad of occasions as misguided attempts to control crop pests, which ultimately failed. So stay tuned for more on that in the invasive animals episode. But one of the most destructive of all these introductions was in Australia, where they were released in the early 1900s in a futile attempt to control the cane beetle in northern Queensland. This is a beetle that's active only during the day, and at night sleeps in the vegetation a couple meters off the ground. Conversely, cane toads aren't active during the day, they're active only at night, and they can't hop and climb. So never where the two shall meet was this kind of case. These star-crossed lovers were destined never to meet, and so the cane toads had no impact at all on the cane beetles. Instead, cane toads have spread across the top end of the country, eating all before them and leaving behind the corpses of large animals that tried to eat them. Australia has a lot of frogs, despite being a very dry country, and so it has a lot of animals that like to eat frogs, or frog-like creatures when they encounter them, like goanna lizards, quolls, and even freshwater crocodiles, all of which are quickly killed by even a small cane toad. A 3-meter crocodile can die from a toad that big in no time at all. So what's going on as far as that we have crocodilians in South America, like caimans, that love eating cane toads in their native range of South America. So why aren't the Australian ones? Well, Australia also has toxic frogs. So what's going on in this regard? Well, anytime you have a toxic animal, you've got a predator-prey relationship, much like we saw with the newts and the garter snakes of a chemical arms race. So in Australia, with the animals that are native here, that have co-evolved with some of the toxic frogs that we have here, they've co-evolved, and so they've evolved resistance as the frogs have evolved toxicity. But in the case of the cane toad, it's something that they're completely naive to, because there's no native toads in Australia, and so they're completely naive to these kinds of toxins. So what might not affect a meter-long caiman, crocodilian in South America who just loves munching toads, will nuke a 3-meter crocodilian here. So it's one of these ones where, because of that biochemical difference, there's no stopping it, and that the powerful neurotoxins, particularly the cardiac ones, absolutely hammer the animals here. And the impact has been absolutely extreme. Like where we do our sea snake research up in northern Australia, up around Weipa, of the 25 years that I've been doing work up there, we haven't seen a single quoll or a single monitor lizard. Animals that used to be abundant there have been completely wiped out by the toads. And these toads have had devastating impacts on other areas where they've spread. And we'll talk about that more in the invasive animals, of just the horrifying impact and the loss of so much biodiversity, including the basically local extinction of animals. Where, for example, in Kakadu, the giant wetlands up in Australia, that we used to love going to this part of northern Australia. When we would do our death adder research, we could get up to 30 a night in some of the areas. Now you'd be lucky to see one in a week. Also, the huge mulga snakes have disappeared. These 2 to 2.5 meter, just heavy built snakes, sort of our answer to a king cobra, are now so rare that they're locally endangered. And this kind of toxic impact is just depressing beyond words. Where I can't go back to Kakadu anymore because it's just too depressing. All I see is the ghosts of the animals I once saw. And as we'll talk about in the invasive animals episode, we'll go in much greater depth about this, of what research has been done to try to kill these sort of toxic invaders, and why so much of it has been unfortunately futile, and in some cases has made it actually worse. So stay tuned for that episode. But for now, this concludes our top 10 poisonous animals episode. Of course, these kinds of things are subjective of which animals were included. I'll certainly be doing future episodes on poisonous animals, so if you have one that you would like featured in a future episode, please put it in the comment section, and I'll make sure to include it in one of the future rundowns. And I'm also interested to learn about people's experience with different poisonous animals in their regions, and any natural history observations that they may have, whether native or some sort of toxic invader. So we'll see you in the next video when we talk about the types of biological agents used in biowarfare and bioterrorism. So as always, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next week.